questions to Professor Chu after his presentation. Now, let me say a few words about the King Center. We work towards the goal of alleviating global poverty, and we do so by supporting research that informs, shapes, and stimulates policies on global development issues. One critical issue, arguably the most pressing issue of our times, is climate change, which, as you know, will have and already has a disproportionate impact on low-income countries and on the poorest within those countries. Working on big challenges like climate change requires a multifaceted approach and the perspectives of a multiplicity of disciplines. So the center does this by supporting large-scale faculty initiatives and emerging scholars from all 7 of Stanford schools, and by facilitating student opportunities at Stanford and abroad. We also regularly convene stakeholders from across campus and engage with policymakers and thought leaders in the public and private sectors. We are very excited to be here today engaging in this timely topic. And with that, I will now pass the stage to my colleague, Scott Frozel, to introduce Sky and our esteemed guests.
Hello, everyone. My name is Scott Rosell. I'm the Helen Farnsworth Senior Fellow and co-director of SCCEI, SCCEI. That's the Stanford Center on China's Economy and Institutions. It's actually the newest center at Stanford. We just started several months ago. For those of you who don't know us, SCCEI is home for empirical, multidisciplinary research on China's economy. The goal of SCCEI and its affiliated faculty are really to provide dispassionate, fact-based research that can help policymakers, business leaders, general public in China and in Washington, New York, Silicon Valley, across the U.S. to navigate, the most important relationship in the world, but one that's been increasingly fraught as of lately. The 3 words that describe us are multidisciplinary. We work across the spectrum from economy to political economy to social development, including the environment. We're multi-organizational. We have affiliates in all 7 schools also, but also with universities in China, with universities around the world. We're trying to create this relationship on academic basis that can help strengthen the ties between our countries. And finally, we're translational. We really want to talk to the business community and to the leadership in Washington, D.C. and Beijing. So with that, let me introduce the person that you really came to listen to today, our speaker, Professor Steven Chu. He's the William R. Kenan Jr. Professor of Physics, and he's also a professor of molecular and cellular physiology in the medical school of Stanford University. He's the chair of the board of American Advancement for the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and he's its past president. As most of you from the U.S. know, he served as U.S. Secretary of Energy, one of our most prominent secretaries of energy ever, from January 2009 to 2013. And Dr. Chu, I think, sure as everybody knows, was the recipient of the 1997 Physics Prize, Nobel Prize. I could go on and on about his many accolades and accomplishments, but I don't want to take time away from his presentation. But I want to do one more thing first. I want to introduce you our moderator for today before passing it over the stage over to Professor Chu. Gretchen Daly, a good friend of mine, a fabulous professor, is the Bing Professor of Environmental Science and the co-founder and faculty director of the Natural Capital Project at Stanford University. We have a whole seminar on the Natural Capital Project, but her work focuses on understanding the dynamics of the change of the biosphere, the implications for human well-being, and most importantly, I think, the deep societal transformation needed to secure people and nature. She engages extensively with governments, with multilateral development banks, with businesses, communities, and NGOs. And again, I could go on and on with her accomplishments, but without further ado, I'm going to turn the stage over to Professor Chu, and then Gretchen will moderate from here. Thank you very much.
All right, I hope you can all hear me well. And so with that, I'll begin, but thank you very much for the very nice introduction. Pleasure to be here. And so let me just share screen. Let's see how we can do this and go to show. And so is that all right? Just someone nod and say yes, but anyway, but let me know. Okay, so.
It's fine.
Thank you. All right, so I want to talk about U.S. and China collaboration on climate change. Very, very quickly, the climate's changing from 1850 to 2020. The temperature has gone up. It has actually gone up by more than 1 degree centigrade since that time. We're seeing changes already. For example, this is a map of the water stresses around the world, and where you see orange and red, it's not a good condition. California is in the red part, as we in California all know. But you see that there are many places that are undergoing water stresses, but there's much more than that. We, with the water stresses, see increased droughts because the summers are hotter. We have heat waves. We see forest fires everywhere around the world, more crop failures, rising seas. So all of these could really create tens to hundreds of millions of climate refugees in the coming decades. And if you say that climate is exacerbated a lot of the refugees in the Middle East going into Europe, there's more of this. Here's some aerial views, not aerial, but of two cities near the coastline, the Pudong area of Shanghai and Lower Manhattan. It turns out about 10% of the world population lives within 10 meters of sea. Why is this significant? It's because if you look back historically in history, not a climate model, but just history, of where the sea level was in the last warm period, which is about a degree, certainly less than 1.5 degrees warmer than we are today. The sea level was 6 to 9 meters higher. How do we know this? It's because you can date when the seashell critters that live on the boundary between land and ocean were alive. And you have to look all around the world because sometimes land subsides, sometimes it rises. And so this so long ago, 69 meters higher, which means much of the stuff you see would be underwater. Now, the other thing I want to remind everybody is that what is relevant is not yearly emissions of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, but it's the cumulative emissions. And why cumulative emissions? Well, it's because, it's because once CO2 is up in the atmosphere, roughly half of it gets absorbed pretty quickly between the oceans and land, roughly half and half. But the rest of it just circulates between the oceans, land, and the atmosphere. And the expected time that half that circulates is about 10,000 years. Now that's uncertain. Could be 5,000 years, could be a little longer, but it's not 50 years, it's not 100 years. So when you start talking about what's going to happen in the future, if there's no way to get that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, don't think 2100, think 12100, you have to move the decimal point over. So for that reason, whether it's 1,000 years or 10,000 years, it's really cumulative that counts. And so this red line is the sort of the danger point that climate scientists say will begin to increase significantly the probability of going above 2 degrees. And remember, we won't even want to stay below 1.5 degrees. Although Yogi Berra did not say, oh, I have to remind you that most of these greenhouse gas emissions have occurred over the last 70 years, since about 1950. Yogi Berra didn't say this, but he could have. And what was said is if you don't change direction, you will end up where you're heading. And where we're heading at our current rate is to go through that line in about 20 years. All right, let me tell you about how we were collaborating with China in times past. As soon as I became Secretary of Energy, we started to look at how we could cooperate with China. And we started several things. One of them was China Clean Energy Research Centers on building efficiency, on carbon capture, and on advanced clean automobiles. My successor, Secretary Ernie Moniz, started another Clean Energy Research Center on water and energy technologies. And the lower right, you see what they were looking at: water reduction treatment, sustainable hydropower. On the left is me, many years younger, and having established this CERC with Wang Gong, who is the Minister of MOST, which is the Minister of Science and Technology. He's a very interesting and lovable character. I think he spent about 2 decades in Germany working for Audi, and he's the only and high-ranking official I know in China who's not a member of the Communist Party. He's a great guy, we made a lasting friendship. So those are some of the things. We also started what's called a Clean Energy Ministerial of about 24 countries that shared best practices. No yuan mandate, no quotas, no nothing. It's just sharing best practices, helping each other. And so these clean energy centers were joint research. And for the first time, we said if it's co-invented by China, and we worked out a patent agreement. Another huge breakthrough happened on the eve, really just before the Paris Climate Accord, where President Obama and President Xi Jinping got together. And it looked like it would be another standoff like in Copenhagen, but at the last minute, they said, look, we're going to agree to work together and China, even though a developing country at the time, said we will begin to make pledges, and they hailed this new era of climate cooperation as the best chance for saving the planet. Well, that was then. I also wanted to add that in addition to buildings and automobiles and carbon capture, I also knew by then that China was the world's leader in battery storage. This is my favorite battery. Let me explain how it works. It pumps water from under the ground to up to this water tower when the wind blows or the sun shines, and it's a couple 100-year-old technology, but it's still the best energy storage we have in the world today, by far. And if I look at pump storage around the world in 2014, surprisingly, Japan led the world in pump storage. What pump storage means is you've got a hydroelectric dam over here, and then below there's a pond, or vice versa. There's a holding pond up here, and there's a source of water down here. You pump water up a hill, that takes energy, but it's gravity, so you have potential energy. You want the power back, the energy back. You let it run through this turbine, run the other way, and you get electricity. Surprisingly, pump storage can be over 80% round trip efficient, which is actually better than the utility scale flow batteries that we have today. Not as good as a lithium ion battery, but certainly better than the flow batteries. 2014, Japan led with 27 gigawatts and roughly equivalent gigawatt hours, twice that. United States was second, China was third. So here's China. And by 2020, which is now, they added a bunch more. And so now they're the world leader in pumped storage. And by 2030, they're talking about another 90 gigawatts. So they would be equivalent of the rest of the world combined. And so what they do have is a series of dams, mostly in southwest China. They have incredible wind resources in northeast and northwest China. And I've been actually talking to them, trying to link up these wind resources. If you can't use the electricity, route it to the dams and pump water up a hill. Anyway, all right, so what's happening? Well, what's happening is that there's some storm clouds that have come on the scene. U.S. and China see each other as global economic competitors and also in strategic influence around the world. And it's not only become a competition, I might say, that it's really going towards, unfortunately, a Cold War mentality. Also, it is known that the Chinese government has helped commercial companies in cyber theft of intellectual property. And this is very disturbing. All companies try to steal from each other, but usually the government stay out of it. And so then the question is, with this growing mistrust, how can we collaborate to combat climate change? And I'm going to talk a little bit about this, but I'm really going to talk about, I'm going to turn the clock backward and talk about a speech I gave in November of 2010, at the end of November. And it was to the Washington Press Club, and I entitled it, "Is the Energy Race Our New Sputnik Moment?" So let me take you back to what I'm talking about. For those of you who were younger, you may not remember, but or you weren't born then, so you probably definitely don't remember. But on October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union put a little 184-pound satellite, about the size of double the size of a basketball, in orbit. And it was a satellite, and this was the headline of the New York Times. And you could actually see, when the light is right, a view from Sputnik from Earth taken, and this satellite was flying over the globe and circling many areas, including Earth. All right, a little more than a month later, President Eisenhower responds to the Sputnik with a major speech. And surprisingly, he did not call for more military spending. And I'm quoting a part of that speech. He said, "According to my scientific friends, one of our greatest and most glaring deficiencies is the failure of us in this country to give high priority enough to scientific education and to the place of science in our national life. One great future danger is that no amount of money or resources currently devoted to it can fully meet. Education requires time, incentive, and skilled teachers. They believe that a second critical need is that of giving higher priority, both public and private, to basic research." Amazing. He wasn't calling for more spending on rockets. And what happened with that speech is it created a huge investment in training young people to become scientists. I was 9-year-olds in 1957, benefited from all the investments given to grade school, high school kids, college kids, to invest in science education in the United States to train a new corps of U.S. scientists. All right, so that was the Sputnik moment. So I'm in the middle of my speech, by the way, of November 2010. U.S. science and technology is at risk, I said a decade ago. In 2009, 51% of U.S. patents were awarded to non-U.S. companies. China has gone from 15th to 5th place in international patents. I think it's either 1 or 2 now. The World Economic Forum ranks the U.S. 48th in quality of mathematics and science education. And China's Tsinghua and Peking universities are the 2 largest suppliers of students who receive PhDs in the United States. So I went on to say, innovation adds wealth of society. Science and technology, research and development lie at the heart of innovation, and leadership and innovation cannot be taken for granted. So I give examples of innovation. Ford Model T in the assembly line, the first transistor, integrated circuits, the first airplane, the invention of satellite communications and global positioning satellites, search engines, and essentially the internet. They all came out of the United States. Great history. But let me also remind people that if you, for example, consider the Ford assembly line, Ford didn't invent the assembly line. He made it better. He certainly didn't invent automobiles or internal combustion engine cars. That was done in Europe. And so what the United States did in those early days is they took developments and inventions in other countries and made it better. Sound familiar? In any case, now the transistor integrated circuits airplanes were different. All right, so I go on to say for over a century, America has led the world in innovation. Today, that leadership is at risk. And and then I went on to quote the then premier of China, Wen Jiabao, who said, we should see scientific and technological innovation as an important pillar and develop new industries of strategic importance. Science and technology is a powerful engine of economic growth. We'll accelerate the development of low carbon economy and a green economy so as to gain advantageous position in the international competition. What was he talking about? He was saying, because of climate change, because of these things, we know what the world will need in the coming decades. We want to be leaders in this world. And so I was saying, that's great. What about us? So we faced a choice. Will we be the innovation leader or fall behind? And I was talking about science, technology, innovation, and discovery in energy, in clean energy, and we really couldn't afford to. All right. But I also wanted to say there are differences between the Sputnik event of 1957 and today's Sputnik challenge. We were in a really serious Cold War with Russia. There was virtually no communication between countries. We did not know each other. And so while we're competing for leadership in energy innovation, we actually have much to gain by cooperating with China, India, and other countries. China has the best high voltage transmission system in the world. They're leaders in high voltage transmission technology today, as they are in pumped storage. And so there are many, many things. We no longer have the monopoly on technologies. And in 2010, I said that China will build new buildings to house 350 million people. That's one U.S. population that move from the countryside into the cities, and 80% of India's infrastructure doesn't even exist today. So these are new markets and new laboratories for innovation. All right, so that's I said more in my speech, but here's transitioning out of the speech. There was a postscript to my November 29th, 2010 speech. Obama liked it. And so 2 weeks later, President Obama talked about our Sputnik moment in his State of the Union address. And we couldn't help but notice what China was goals and what they wanted in technology development from Wen Jiabao and others were exactly the same things that President Obama and I and others wanted for the United States. So its goals were exactly the same. And then the other thing that we were afraid of, the way to respond to a challenge is to be constructive about it. And we were also afraid that U.S. investment in science, education, and R&D was going up, but China's was going up much faster. And so in this graph, I show that what has happened between 2000 and 2000, I think it goes to 2017. And then what I did is I took the published reports of what China's increase in R&D was since 2017, and it has seemingly past the U.S. and of course Europe. The response is we should think of Eisenhower and increase investments in science, technology, and STEM education, and not erecting walls to international collaborations and basic research. Well, that was the thought. I should also mention that immigrants have been added immensely to our scientific and technological excellence. For example, if you think of Nobel Prizes and you think of American Nobel Prizes, it turns out 34% of all United States laureates, that's where they were when they got the Nobel Prize, were actually first generation, which means they were born in other countries. And if we count second generation immigrants, I'm a second generation immigrant. My parents came to the U.S. to study in graduate school at MIT and had us. And it's very likely, it's hard to count because the Nobel laureates don't sometimes identify where their parents came from. I'm guessing half or more. Turns out that all 7 physics Nobel laureates born in China earned their PhDs in the US and became American citizens, which is telling in several respects. One of the things it's very telling is that the US education system in graduate school and postdoctoral education is, in my opinion, still by far the best in the world. All right, what else? It's not about Nobel laureates, it's also about foreign students. And as we all know, foreign students, this is from a Jason report commissioned by the National Science Foundation and looking at fundamental research security a couple of years ago. And foreign students represent roughly 35% of the graduate students throughout science, health, engineering. In physical sciences, over 30% of masters, over 40% of PhDs are foreign. And China alone counted for 34% of this total, okay? Many of the students would come to the United States, fall in love with our country, and set up roots here, raise their families here, and so on and so forth. So we have benefited from this immensely. So here's where we are in terms of the challenges and stresses we face. So I'm just going to start the point in the remaining minute or 3 about this. What do we do about it? And it's really about growing mistrust. And how do you reverse growing mistrust? We have mistrust across America between rural and urban, between political parties, and we have growing mistrust internationally as well. And I can say for certain that if we retreat into our own political bubbles, communicate only with those people who are in our little spheres of communication, which includes university people talking to university people, and building walls between countries does not build trust. In fact, once you stop communicating with people, demons start to appear, and it's very, very bad. So I'm going back to this Jason report and what the United States should do about academic research and the potential for so-called academic spying. And so they talked about something called a National Security Decision Directive, 189, and it was established by President Reagan and reaffirmed by 2 other presidents since then. And it defines fundamental research. Fundamental research means basic and applied research in science and engineering, the results of which ordinarily are published and shared broadly within the scientific community, as distinguished from proprietary research and from industrial development, design, production, and product utilization, the results of which ordinarily are restricted for proprietary or national security reasons. It goes on to say, it is the policy of this administration that to the maximum extent possible, the products of fundamental research remain unrestricted. It is also the policy of this administration that where the national security requires control, the mechanisms for control of information generated during federally funded fundamental research in science, which is defined as that which will be published, technology and engineering at colleges, universities, and laboratories is classification. No restrictions may be placed upon the conduct or reporting of federally funded fundamental research that has not received national security classification. An amazing statement, right? Now, before you publish, you keep it the secret within your group. You don't want to be scooped, but after you publish, it becomes universal. And so this is what is the basis of how the world does science. So what is happening today in DC? Well, there are forces pushing to restrict university science collaborations and the training of graduate students internationally, but it's really aimed at China. Very, very scary stuff. The Chinese American professors all over the country are feeling they're being watched, as are the graduate students and postdocs. All right, so we must safeguard against attempts by China and other countries to gain early inappropriate access to what U.S. researchers are doing in fundamental research. But that's only, trying to get a peek under the hood before you're ready to publish. But restricting international scientific collaboration with China and non-approval of student visas of Chinese PhD students are not in the best interest of the United States. Think of it, a third of the graduate students in science and engineering are from China. Now, in closing, I'm going to return to Eisenhower's speech and its response to Sputnik. And he said, although tonight's purposes, and remember, his speech was a month after Sputnik, he came out to assure the American public the national security was not at risk. But really to say, we're going to invest and we're going to triple down on science education and grow our most precious asset, the intellectual capability of our people. So he says, I stress the influence of science on defense. Although tonight's purpose, I stress the influence of science and defense, the peaceful contributions of science to healing, to enriching life, to freeing the spirit. These are the most important products of the conquest of nature's secrets. Never shall we cease to hope and work for the coming of the day when scientists can give his and her, that's mine, full attention not to human destruction, but to human happiness and fulfillment. What an amazing speech. In 1895, Alfred Nobel signed his final will, leaving his entire estate to endow, quote, prizes to those who during the preceding year, it's been relaxed a little, have conferred the greatest benefit to humankind. He said mankind, so it's a little edit. What am I talking about? Open and honest collaborations in science is needed. It's needed to maintain trust, to nurture international trust, and it was a line of communication. Even in the darkest days of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, there were backdoor channels so we didn't blow each other up. Today is different. Many people in China have been educated in the United States. Many of us have friends and colleagues and know each other as they know us. We do not want to throw this away. And with that, I'll stop and decide what to do next. So I go stop share, and that's it. I think I was even within time.
That was beautifully done. Can't thank you enough, Steve, for sharing those really moving reflections, as well as the, the sort of factual, intellectual, rational argumentation. The side of humanity that really is led by the heart is what we need to bring to the fore now, while we make our rational, strategic plans. And you sure said it beautifully. We've got a lot of people listening, over 550. Wow. Many people are submitting questions, and I'm going to have some help here in moderating a discussion that will be really led by questions coming from the audience. But maybe I'll take the privilege of moderator while some of these questions come in and get more organized. Just to tee off with something, I happened to do my postdoc with another physicist, John Holdren, who really helped. He devoted a lot of his life to keeping the peace with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and played a lead role in what were called the Pugwash conferences that won the Nobel Peace Prize some years back for maintaining the kind of trust, the connections, the way you describe your friendship with the person now heading the Ministry of Science and Technology in China. And I'm sure many of the people engaged in the conversation here today have such friendships and share the perspective you're offering. And I just wonder if you could maybe elaborate a little bit more on what we might do as a community within our own institutions, whether based here at Stanford or many participants are coming from the community nearby and community all over the world. What can we do as individuals to help convey the message that you have laid out so beautifully? And what are the different roles that people can play, whether in academia or as thought leaders or possibly in companies or just influencing the U.S. stance and lowering the temperature and opening up more conversation on this pathway to opening and really securing a deeper trust?
Okay, great question. So this is a physicist's view of how you build trust and not. You build trust by doing things together that may have nothing to do with what you're supposed to be doing. And by that, I mean the following. If you look at members of Congress, in the olden days, they all used to live in DC, most of them, and they would send their kids to schools in DC, and they would meet each other, not across the aisle in Congress, but in soccer games and band and things like that. And so you end up getting to know different sides of people in a very much more natural setting. Now, it's very natural if you're a collaborator and you have a common interest. And let's say I have Chinese colleagues and we're trying to figure out nature. We want to understand nature, and ultimately someone over there might have an idea and I say, that's great. Or someone over here might have an idea, they say, it's great. And we no longer have a monopoly on these things. But a lot of it begins, and we talked before the show started about amateur athletics when in high school, and really goofy things. And so I think you build trust by spending some time with each other, not taking formal roles and positions. That's number one on my list. But just this idea of spending time together, there's an ancient tradition in cultures. You eat together and you drink together. And what does that have to do with science, diplomacy, business, you name it? You breaking bread together is a way of doing something everybody does, and you let down your guard. And so those are the things. It's small stuff, but it's, in the end, it is personal trust that makes the world go.
Really well said, and certainly harkens as well to what was reported a lot in the obituaries of George Shultz, saying that over the arc of his long career, the moments when magic happened and great things got done were moments of trust, where people were together in the kind of natural setting you're mentioning. Let me turn to a couple questions just to get going from the audience. So I'm going to pick up on one from perhaps a student asking, what advice do you have for young Chinese PhD students in the West, or maybe young people who've recently finished their PhD who feel the tug in both directions. How can young people such as them help reduce tensions through science?
Mm-hmm. Well, first, we're in a very sad state of affairs now because of the rhetoric of the previous president of COVID. But then, this economic competition and saber rattling is going to exacerbate that, and it ignites blatant racism. I'm going to be frank about this, and it's tragic. And so so people will feel uneasy, but I would say to those students, look at some of the great sides. Most Americans are decent, great people. and I think I'm hoping this is fueled by a minority, and it will pass. There are opportunities in China, but then you're giving up other things. You're going to be giving up a significant amount of ability to express yourself freely. You will be watched very closely, and that's no secret. Every classroom in China and major university will have a watcher. Universities have two lines of authority. There's a president provost, the academic line, and there's the government line. And the government line has significantly asserted more authority. In one university where I have some colleagues and friends, Fudan University, I have colleagues and friends in Tsinghua, Fudan, all over the place, but it was, and Fudan used to have as one of its major stated principles is academic freedom. A couple of years ago, that went away. And they took it down and they said, it's allegiance to the party, and the students of Fudan protested. And so this is not a good time. And so now I'm going to be selfish. I'm an American. I would want them to stay here. but I could easily see these tugs. I'm selfish. I'm American. I was born here, which is the other good thing about the United States. By the time you're second generation, you're accepted. If you're in Europe, you could be fifth generation. You can be fifth generation born in Switzerland, and you can't even have citizenship, right? You have to run for election. So it's a very different thing. So there are good and bad things in both places. You have to. It's opportunity. It's how you value things, and it's a difficult choice. I might say that 30 years ago, the choice was easy. There was much more opportunity in the United States. We were pouring in money for science education and things like that. And so you come from abroad and you say, my gosh, this is great. The opportunities were in the U.S. and the appreciation for science was there, and everything else is there. The appreciation for science has just gone a little bit low, but it's still fundamentally there. I'm going to be an optimist. But these are difficult choices. And I have to say, I had one postdoc who was going to postdoc with me for a couple of years, and she just got so scared. And she said, I can't stand it. Trump is going to get reelected. And I said, no. They're not looking at you. Just do your work. I'll protect you. They're looking at me. But she said no. So she took a faculty position in the Chinese Academy of Sciences in China. She had a faculty offers in the U.S. She said, I can't stand it. This is tragic that people leave because they're afraid of what the government or people in the United States would do. Very tragic. And so I'm doing what I can quietly behind the scenes to lower the temperature. There are people on both sides of the aisle in Congress who know we're not shooting ourselves in the foot. It's closer to the head with our current policies.
Yeah, we're getting a lot of good questions pouring in now, actually, on the themes you're touching on. So I'm going to convey maybe 3 questions so you can kind of play through them. That there's 3 that kind of come in a bundle.
Sure.
So a lot of people are writing in about how much decision makers, politicians focus on economic dimensions of security. And so asking, what would a healthy level or type of economic competition between the U.S. and China look like when it comes especially to climate change? Do we need to choose between collaboration and competition? And related to that, if you can hold all these in your head, but relatedly, what are some of the biggest opportunities for U.S.-China cooperation, presumably in the economic dimensions, as well as driving real impact globally to tackle climate change? And wondering then, looking ahead, whether the upcoming climate summit to be held in April by the Biden administration, could that be a moment to have an icebreaker here? Any reflections along those lines?
Yeah, I indicated very briefly and indirectly in some of my talk. If you think about, let's say, the electrical system in China and the United States, we build these electrical systems domestically. You're not going to put that on a boat and ship it overseas. You could put transformers and things like that, but the installation of the grid, you don't put. So what can we give to China? What can China give to us? China, as I said, is a leader in long distance transmission distribution, ultra high voltage. What are we good at? We're actually pretty good at very complex systems that know how to juggle. And as we go to renewable energies, it becomes much more important. How do you juggle both long distance transmission, local distribution, intermittent sources of wind and solar? We're better than China at that, because China will say, okay, we'll build this many wind turbines, this many solar, huge amounts of water, but it's excess and they dump it in the ground. The United States is economically driven in very different ways. No generator of electricity wants to dump the energy into the ground. And so they're economically motivated. And that's different than a large state program. But China is willing to experiment much more than the United States. And so I can see huge benefits. Building efficiency, similar. Building smarter cities, similar. Right? These are things that I just see very little competition. Automobiles now, EVs, intense competition. But that's true not only of China and the United States, it's true of the United States and Europe and everywhere. So certain things like battery technologies, how you integrate it into EV. Now, most of the batteries today for EVs are built, guess where? In Asia, and the lion's share in China. I'm an advisor to a company that used to make semiconductor, it still does, it's a leader, it's called Applied Materials. It makes semiconductor technology for the most advanced chips. TSMC, Intel, Samsung, they all buy from this company in the United States. This is the last jewel we actually have. Is with the equipment that makes stuff. Now, they used to sell solar factories to China, and then Chinese would buy them. They would turn them upside down. They would look, we can do this. And they started building factories that Applied Materials was building, except just as good. And then they started tweaking, making them even better. So Applied Materials said, we can't do that anymore. So we can't sell factories anymore. We got to sell stuff. And so they're making great advances in semiconductors and batteries, and they want to sell stuff. But they also realize that not only does China, but other companies. Oh, by the way, industrial espionage is not. China didn't invent this. There's an industrial espionage that goes all around the world, and it's most intense within companies in Silicon Valley, if you actually want to know. If you want to steal someone's secrets, you'll go hire that person. And as a good friend of mine, Jen Wang, who is the CEO and founder of NVIDIA, which is a big gaming company. By the way, you may not know, NVIDIA worth on the stock market is worth more than Intel today. Founded by a Chinese immigrant, I think from Taiwan, okay. And I was talking to him about this security and what are the issues, and he, maybe a month or two ago, I was on the board in video until I took my Valve property and joined this energy department, so I had to resign. But I got to be friends with Jensen. And he said, well, you know, there's nothing really you can do about this because we outlawed slavery long ago. And he said, you know, if you want to keep company secrets, you're not allowed to let people leave. And that's how Silicon Valley steals from each other. And that's how everybody tries to get, you know, they hire their people. And he says, the only secret is you out innovate and you keep up the pace of innovation. When it becomes a commodity and something, you know, then you have nothing. And so again, I go back to, you know, don't get defensive. You know, when the Germans and then the Japanese started building better cars, what did U.S. automobile manufacturers do? They went to Congress and said, erect tariffs, keep that stuff out of, you know, not make better cars. And then there was a lot of pressure, and then the companies will say, well, we'll build a factory, you know, Toyota will say, we'll build a factory in the United States, you know, a Camry factory in Ohio, someplace like that. It's, that's fine, but you'll never be able to compete with us. They built factories, and as you know, they started making better cars, and we're competing. And you know what the last resort was? The U.S. started making better cars. Why can't we? You know, it's what Churchill said. You know, invariably, the United States does the right thing after exhausting all possible alternatives.
Good one. Okay, well, let me ask you one last thing, and just for kind of a closing moment here, that you've covered a lot of what people have written in on, and really beautifully. But here's a last thing in terms of the U.S. doing the right thing as the last resort. Apparently, I didn't see it yet, but Tom Friedman published a column today in which he explicitly lays out how it's internal polarization in the U.S. that, you know, and the misinformation wars that have handed China a massive strategic advantage in this competition that we've got going. And the question is about, you know, the linkage between internal and external mistrust and what an insoluble or tricky problem that poses. How can we rebuild trust with China when there's such forces devoting to stoking this mistrust within? Maybe a closing reflection on that, and then I'll draw us all to a close and say how we can head off in a little further conversation in small groups.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great observation. It was essentially what I was talking about in half of my talk. If you think about it, because there's such mistrust among Republicans and Democrats, and then one side says we're going to make an enemy of China, an external enemy. Lots of people capitalize, you know, a Cold War enemy is good because it takes people's minds away from solving their own problems. They also want to make internal enemies. You know, this is out of a playbook from Nazi Germany, and maybe you're just not a century ago, but you know, long time ago, and you make enemies, and the idea of you getting ahead by making an enemy is crazy. Okay. There are certain things, like I said, you know, you want to guard proprietary company secrets and batteries and things like that. Fine. But there's so many things you can benefit with of common markets and know-how. Again, China is rapidly developing scientifically. And even if you're a little bit ahead, you know, there's no guarantee you stay that way. And it's just this open to, okay, we're going towards a common goal. What's the enemy? The enemy is us in climate. Okay, this is what we got to be focusing on. You know, that's the 800-pound gorilla that's going to really make things miserable for everybody. And so of those things, anywhere you can say, there's no, you know, this is ridiculous. you can get together in so many areas for climate. The other thing is, you know, you have to parse it. You know, there's the difference between academic, educational, and industrial and military, right? These are a wide gamut of things. And so I think wise people recognize this difference. But when stoking the fears and in this polarization and internet stuff, other people want to cover it up.
That is a really key note to end on, and actually gives us a launch pad into these discussions. So let me first off, really thank you for making time for this and all your expertise, technical and all these different areas, expertise in leading the U.S. in kind of science and technology and energy. And just thanks for joining all of us today. And then second, I'd like to welcome everyone here to join a small group discussion. So you'll see with this notice up on the screen, we've got a key question that we're going to ask people to focus on, or invite everybody to focus on. And it's the one that Professor Chu just left off with. And it's basically, you know, what are effective ways for all of us across the public here to influence leaders of China and the U.S. to commit to stricter policies, more ambitious policies that we need, collaborate with one another, and hold leaders accountable for meeting climate goals. So that's a question we can tee up for ourselves if we want. There are 2 rooms to join, and then we'll be broken up into smaller rooms still, I think. One in English and one for conversation in Chinese. And it's a way for all of us to get to know one another better and contribute to building the trust that Professor Chu and many before him, going back to Eisenhower and others, are calling for in this crucial moment. So thank you again, and I look forward to seeing you in one of these rooms.
My pleasure. And so we just leave.